we definitely find that there is a lot of common ground in the customer base. A lot of your applications are in a fairly similar place. They came from a fairly similar place. A lot of you are facing common challenges, common problems, and trying to solve the same kind of things. It's great to be able to identify and just discuss and talk through some of those challenges and try and help you guys figure out some of the strategies. So what we thought we'd do in this session is just go through some of that process with you, with everybody here, and just highlight what are some of the common issues that come up, what are the thought processes behind identifying those issues, and what are some of the common solutions? Because as well as common problems, there's a fairly consistent set of common things that you can do to address some of those problems. So we'll just go through some of those as well. I apologize, some of these may seem perfectly obvious to you because we've already had the conversation or you've figured this out and figured out a solution, but hopefully there's something for everybody in here. The first thing that may seem obvious is just to, first of all, be upfront and admit that there are some issues and try and analyze and discuss and plan what those problems are. Analyze the current situation. All too often, it's like, oh, we got to do something, but nobody's actually sat down and taken the time to just really think about it in detail. Well, what are the problems? And in particular, what are our strengths? Because your applications very often have an awful lot of strengths. And it's also easy to focus on the weaknesses at sometimes and lose sight of the fact that you're all actually very, very good at what you do. There's just a few things that have got to be tweaked and improved. So the first thing is just going through a process of analyzing what the current situation is. And very often we find that companies haven't done this. They haven't taken the time to step back and just go through a process that is simply focused on talking to each other. And talking about this current situation, discussing all the possible solutions. It's all too frequent that sometimes people get sort of ingrained in who they are and what they do and how they work and think, well, we can't do it any other way, it's too big. The challenge is too big, our application is what it is and it's never going to change. And that's certainly not the case, and there are numerous people in this room that are proof that that is not the case. You'll see a great demo from one of them. I'm not saying that the customer that's demoing next was behaving that way, but they're a great example of how things absolutely can be moved forward in a fabulous way. Formulate a plan, document the plan, distribute the plan, and invite feedback as widely as you can. I think on 2 at least, or 3 separate occasions, I've been invited out to go and join in that process with a customer, because it's surprising how many of those barriers can be broken down if there's an external facilitator there. And somebody who's totally kind of impartial and not involved and invested in the actual process, but is able to take a step back and just look and help guide the process of identifying, well, what are the issues and getting some dynamic thinking going. So we can help in that process. If you feel like you want some help in that process, by all means speak to your account managers at Synergex. The other thing I would suggest right at the outset is this is an iterative process. It's very unlikely that if you sit down and write on a piece of paper, okay, the problems are X, Y, and Z, and let's think about it for 10 minutes, these are the solutions. It's unlikely you'll get that right the first time, okay? Because there's an awful lot of moving parts in the modern computer industry and the modern software industry, and there's a lot of things to be considered and a lot of different directions you can go in. And it really kind of does require that iterative process of, what do we think the problem is? How could we go about it? Okay, let's review what we came up with. Oh, hang on, what about if we do this? Maybe that's a good idea. So, go through an iterative process and don't expect to get things right the first time. Be willing to adapt is basically what I'm saying. Just to sort of set the stage for this presentation, I'm trying to recognize that there are 2 discrete sets of customers in this room. We at Synergex have 2 primary types of customers. Of course, we have integrated software vendors, our ISVs, and our end users. The split between those, if you're interested, about 45% of our user base, purely in terms of numbers of customers, not anything to do with revenue or anything like that, but about 45% of our customers are ISVs, and 55% of our customers are end users, okay? And clearly there can be some different priorities. The ISVs are creating software for resale. They're already predominantly on graphical user interfaces of some kind, be that Windows or browser-based typically. Most provide standard packages that are customizable through settings and switches and so on. Some do a lot more customization, and those organizations tend to have larger development teams in many cases. And then we've got the end users, the other 55% of our user base, who are maintaining line of business applications for their own internal businesses. Some of those applications are homegrown, some of them were originally purchased perhaps from one of the ISVs, but they're always absolutely heavily customized. Those applications tend to be predominantly character-based still, so they're on the Unix, Linux, VMS platforms typically. Not always, some of them are on Windows. In fact, I did an analysis of all this recently, and I found that within the end user base, the split between Unix, VMS, and Windows is almost exactly 33, 33, 33, which actually surprised me. I thought the Windows component was going to be higher in the end user base, but it's pretty much Unix and Linux is 33%, Windows is 33%, and so is VMS. So despite many of you being in a similar place, some of you do have slightly different priorities. So I'm sure that 100% of this session won't apply to all of you, but hopefully there's something in the session that everybody can take something away from and get some benefit from. The first thing I would encourage as you're going through this process of analyzing things, it's a sort of regarded as somewhat of an old management technique or whatever, but I've found that the good old SWOT analysis really does work in this situation. As long as you involve a wide group of people who've got different viewpoints, then there's nothing wrong with the good old SWOT analysis. And spending time looking at what do we think our strengths are, what do we think our weaknesses, our opportunities and our threats, and documenting them and going through the process, ideally off-site. Go off-site and do it. Get everybody relaxed. Do it in casual clothes with whatever, and go through the process, do it iteratively, and involve as many people as you can, get as many different viewpoints as you can as input to that process. Sort of things you're going to be considering, there's lots of different moving parts, but be thinking about platforms and versions and UI options and data. How do you deploy the application? Is it monolithic? Is it client server? Is it fully distributed? Be thinking about the functionality in your applications or the lack of functionality. What are you missing? What are you really good at? What trends are happening in the industry? What direction are things moving in over there? And also, what do your current customers think? Your customers being your employees if you're end users, or your actual customers if you're ISVs. Try and solicit some input from those guys as well. Don't just think you know what you need to do. Have the consumers of your application involved in that process and have them tell you what you need to do. So from a platform point of view, I'm just going to go through a few of the things that commonly come up as might be part of the issue. And one of them clearly is the platform. Is the platform part of the problem? And also, is it really part of the problem, or is it just perceived as part of the problem? There's been a lot of, we found on a lot of occasions that you take one look at the VMS platform or the Unix platform and it's like, that's gotta go, just because. But is it really part of the problem? Sometimes it is, but surprisingly, sometimes it's not. Because, the current application might be a monolithic application with a character-based application or a character-based user interface, and you might be migrating that towards a distributed application with a highly graphical desktop UI or a web front end, and that Unix server or that Linux server might be the perfect server for that new application. And all of that existing code and all of that existing data with a little bit of massaging and a little bit of refactoring might be exactly what's needed to drive the new thing. So it might not be part of the problem. If you determine the hardware or the platform is part of the problem, you need to then look at, is migration desirable or is it absolutely required? Are there some absolute reasons that you really need to get off the platform? And also then, of course, you need to look at, is it feasible? Usually, with Synergy applications, migrating to a different platform is relatively straightforward. I usually say it's something that falls with it. For most applications, there will be exceptions on both ends, but it's something that falls into the sort of couple of months of man effort, typically, I think, to address most of the issues in a typical DBL system or a typical Synergy system. It's usually the DBL code itself migrates relatively easily. It's all the other things, all the things around it, all the scripts, all the printing environments, all the faxing environments, all of that kind of stuff that kind of takes the effort. But in some cases it may not be feasible. So that's certainly one area that you need to do some analysis in. Versions also are something that's easy to overlook, but in some cases, just old versions of things are a large contribution or contributor to the problem. So our old versions of things causing part of the problem, that could be the operating system, it might be the development tools that you're using, it might be third-party products that you're using. What I would suggest when it comes to versions, if you're planning a platform migration anyway, then the very first thing to do is start off with that new platform and get up to date on everything. Don't be migrating to an old version of something just because that's what you used on the old environment. If you're going to do a major platform migration, at least start by updating everything. And if you're not planning a platform migration, you might want to consider anyway getting everything up to date. Certainly with things like Synergy, we do constantly come across people who just don't have access to what Synergex have done for the last 10 years. And we've done a lot of stuff in the last 10 years. Synergy has been transformed in the last 10 years. But if you're still running Synergy 7.5 or 8.3, you don't have a lot of that stuff. And you are somewhat limited in what you can do and how you can produce applications that are credible in today's modern world. So think about versions. Also, the old version problem isn't just about VMS and Linux and Unix. The old version problem does apply on Windows too. As I mentioned earlier, I'm constantly surprised sometimes seeing really old Windows hardware out in the user base, not only on developer systems, but XP, Vista, 2003 really should not exist in the IT workspace anymore. Windows 7 and Windows 2008 R2, you should be in the planning process for figuring out how and when you're going to get rid of those things. End of support for those things is in the late 2019 timeframe. 2 years from now, it's out of extended support. So be thinking about that. User interface. Is UI part of the problem, the UI of the application? Clearly, this is the most common single reason for desired change. You know, we need a new UI, we've got to have a new UI. But it's not always the case. We have come across some people fairly recently actually who are completely happy with their character-based UI on their open VMS systems and very happy there. They need the applications to do some different things, but it's, you know, they're not desperate for a new UI. But clearly, the vast majority of cases, it's the UI that's driving the need for change. And that's, you know, that's fairly obvious. So think carefully when selecting a new UI. You might think it's obvious, we've got to get to Windows. But that's not always the best choice. There are a lot of other choices around. Don't just automatically assume that it has to be Windows. The desire for a new UI is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of moving pieces that you've got to think about and put in place. And I'll talk more about UI in a little while. But also these days, you've got to ask, is a single UI enough? What about desktop? Well, okay, that's probably the default that we assume we need a new desktop application. But what about browser? Is browser more appropriate? And certainly these days, you can't ignore the requirement for mobile. You know, less and less people are buying laptop-type devices or computer PC-type devices. More and more people are buying mobile devices these days as well. So do you need more than one new UI? And how do you structure the application to support that well without having to do a bunch of duplicate development and so on? And what technologies should you use? Also, I encourage you to think about what the impact of your current UI is when selecting a new one. Because one thing is for sure, you know, if your current application uses Telnet or SSH in a character-based application, and it probably does if you're considering a new UI, then you know, that is about as lightweight and fast as it gets. It's about the least demanding on bandwidth, and you know, and pretty much anything else you choose is going to be more demanding on resource than that. And very frequently, we wind up, or I've seen a situation where we've got to have the latest and greatest distributed application, blah, 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 blah. Oh, but bandwidth's a problem because all of our customers are in the middle of nowhere. And, you know, certainly can't get anything approaching good broadband connectivity. So you've got to consider, almost all new applications these days are going to be distributed in nature, and that bandwidth issue is one of the biggest things you've got to look at. Okay, so it's a big concern. And it's one of the areas that maybe browser apps are more appropriate in some cases, rather than defaulting to, we've got to have a desktop UI. Another thing that frequently comes up is, well, what about the data? Okay, what is the data? Where is the data today? Is it in SDMS, Synergy, ISAM? very often, or RMS on the VMS world, or is it already partially or fully in a relational database? And is that a problem? Is that part of the problem? And almost always the immediate answer is yes, we've got to get rid of that. Okay, but rarely is it, I believe, actually the case. I would encourage you to think about, is it really a problem? Does it really matter where the data is, or is what's important your ability to get to the data, analyze the data, manipulate the data, and use modern third-party tools to do things with that data? Does it really matter if it's in Synergy ISAM, as long as you can do all of those things? And often when you go through the process of analyzing what the problem is, like I say, the immediate reaction is, oh, we've got to get rid of this ISAM data. And the final solution very often doesn't involve doing that at all. It's just manipulating things so that you can achieve what you want. So accessibility of data is usually the real issue. Another thing to think about is the deployment model. How is the application deployed? Is it currently a centralized application that everything runs on one big central server that people connect to? Be it a character-based system or be it Windows, the same considerations can apply to a Windows Terminal Services type environment. And this also applies to the business logic and the data. It's not just about one or the other. So is the business logic distributed through tools like XF Server Plus, or is it monolithic? Where does the data reside? Is the data separate from the business logic? Are there network connections involved? What are the bandwidth implications of that? So again, don't just jump into assuming that we have to have a desktop application with a relational database at the back. There's a lot of issues that can impact that decision. Again, not least of which, again, is the impact on the network and the availability of network wherever it needs to be to make any new application run well and perform. Another thing to think about, this one's probably fairly obvious to you as software developers, is the functionality of the application. Are there shortcomings in what your current application does that are causing part of the problem? To be honest, this is rarely part of the problem. Almost always we hear, no, our app does everything we need it to. Our customers love it, our end users, our employees love it, it does what we need. They don't necessarily look like the way it looks or feels or the way they interact with it, but they love the core functionality of the application itself. So the functionality is not frequently a big part of the problem, but there are some common issues with functionality that tend to come up time and time again. Things like inflexible capabilities. The ability to, every one individual program is fine and does what it needs to do, but the inability to be doing more than one thing at a time and switch between things easily is frequently part of the problem. The necessity for users to connect 2 or 3 or 4 times and switch between terminal sessions or run multiple instances of the application in a browser or on the desktop, there's an issue perhaps because it's inconvenient for them and they don't like it. Well, either they can't do it, perhaps for licensing reasons or whatever else, or it's inconvenient to switch between things. So addressing that sort of thing can often be really help. Another thing that tends to come up quite often is complex navigation. Our older systems that have these hierarchical multi-tier menuing systems where it's 1, 4, 3, 9, 15 to get to the program you want, and then you've got to back out 4 levels and go down another 5 levels to get to the next one you want, and you're constantly doing it because you can only run one thing at a time. These are the sort of issues to be looking at what can you do to solve those problems. Another thing is complex or inflexible navigation. That's really the same thing, I guess. Secret functionality that's hidden away that you've got to know that you have to press the F19 key at a certain point to make something happen. But there's nothing that tells you that on the screen. You just got to know that. We all know that. Over complex screens, frequently for newer people who are encountering our applications for the first time. The old 24/80 grid that we all used to and many of us still do work with, really encouraged us to cram every little bit we could onto that screen, and you just look at it and go, whoa, where is everything? So can we do something about that? Can we simplify the UI? Another frequent one is inflexible reporting. Just can't get the information I need out of the system. And again, that tends to lead into we have to have a relational database discussion and so on. But there are things that can be done about all of these things. I did some research a little while ago, and there was a big study done by the Standish Group, who are one of the well-recognized research companies. in the business world. And it is a somewhat old study. It goes back to the early part of the noughties. I still think it's reasonably accurate, and we hear this kind of thing all the time. The study they did said that when they looked at typical enterprise line of business applications, what they found was that on average only 7% of the features of those applications are used always, all the time. A further 13% are used fairly frequently, so only 20% are used all the time or frequently. 16% of it is, sometimes gets used, and a whopping 64% of the functionality of typical enterprise line of business applications, 64% never gets used, okay? And I hear that all the time, particularly when we're doing things like platform migrations or talking about doing a platform migration. It usually comes up that, we think half of this we never even use, but we don't really know. We don't have the ability to quantify that. And it seems to be a common problem. So looking at some way of, if 64% of your code base is never used, that can seriously cut down the amount of time it takes to do a platform migration or build a new version of the application or apply a new user interface. So perhaps that kind of analysis is something that should be going on at a fairly early stage. Consider the current strengths and weaknesses. You might be surprised when you start really listing, this is what we really do well, that list might be quite a bit longer than the weaknesses. So you might be surprised. But encourage brutal honesty as well. Sometimes there's a tendency for people to be a little bit shy about criticizing things. This is not the time for that. You really need to open up and allow people to be honest and give you an honest evaluation of things. Otherwise, you're going to reinvent the same thing again and you're going to be not much better off. Another common problem, access control and auditing. The inability to configure who can do what is frequently a problem. Maybe you've got a security model in place, but it's not flexible enough to restrict what really needs restricting and allowing access to. I came across a situation recently where, for a number of reasons, it was pretty much impossible for the company to add new users to the system. It required programmer effort to add a new user to the system. So there's something that needs addressing straight away, and so on. Some of the best feedback you'll get is from your new hires. If you allow them to do so and encourage them to do so and reassure them that they're not going to get fired, then that's where you're going to get the best feedback about what, how your application is and so on. Clearly, one of the common criticisms of older software is the difficulty in training new hires. It's hard to learn, and the problem is getting worse as the demographics in companies change. The younger end of the scale of the younger end of the people in the business marketplace these days probably have never encountered character-based software. They don't know what to do with it. They don't understand it. And I think even worse than that, they don't understand the concept of modal software that we were all building a few years ago. The WinForms app where you pop up a form and pop up a form and pop up a form. That's not the way modern apps are built, and the younger generation sometimes struggle with that. They don't get the way it works. No, but surely I just swipe and I just do this, and I want to go to this and jump back to there, and I have to swipe more than once, or I have to use more than one finger. Seriously, it's worth considering. Is that a problem, and how can you go about that? So strategies. Those are some of the things that crop up on a frequent basis. Not always, but some combination of those very often. The best strategy really depends on a lot of different things, and certainly the list I've just given you is not an exhaustive list, it's just the common ones. But certainly depends on where you are now and where you define that you need to get to, the nature of your applications and all kinds of things. The point is there's a lot of moving parts that really need considering. It isn't just as simple as we have to get to Windows. Maybe that is the right outcome, but maybe there's some real problems in that as well, and maybe considering some alternatives would be a good idea. So, some of the possible solutions. So these are some of the things that come out as strategies out of that kind of analysis. One of them clearly can be a platform migration. Platform migrations, as I mentioned, can be fairly easy or can be pretty hard. There's no absolute definite answer to this. Sometimes I've literally done a platform migration for one company in literally 4 days. In fact, there was one instance where we did it in 4 days. They were planning on doing 3 weeks of testing. Their confidence level was so high within a couple of days of testing that they just pulled the plug on the old system and went live. That's one end of the scale. the other end of the scale, and I'm not going to mention any names, but some people seem to spend years trying to get to the new platform. And that's kind of step one in the process, probably. So, you know, I think the lesson to learn here is if you decide you're going to make a platform change, get on with it and get it done. Okay? Because really, the platform change doesn't give you anything new. You know, changing from Unix to Linux or Unix to or Linux to Windows doesn't change the way the application looks and feels one iota. It's still, if it's coming from Unix, Linux, VMS, it's still a character-based application. So now it's on Windows. Maybe it's easier to add some new functionality, but the reason you're doing the platform migration in the first place is probably step one in a multi-step process to do, you know, apply a new user interface of some kind and refactor the back end into services so you can put mobile applications on there and so on. So create a plan and get it done. For further information on that, Don's going to be presenting essentially a case study of a recent project that we've been involved with along those lines. I think that one was a VMS to Windows example, but whether it's VMS or whether it's Linux or Unix to Windows, you know, I'm saying to Windows all the time because rarely does anybody migrate off Windows. So, you know, usually it's one of the character-based environments to the Windows environment. Migrating character-based UI to Synergy Windows. There are some fairly good reasons to consider this, even if you're not doing a platform migration. To me, there are two primary benefits of this. One of them might be to retain all of the functionality of your character-based application when you do move to Windows. So if you're going to move from any of the character platforms to Windows, changing your UI code to use Synergy Windows is probably part of that scenario, simply because of the limited availability of, you know, ASCII escape sequences and those sort of things just don't exist on the Windows environment to the same extent that they do elsewhere. You know, you can get away with very basic stuff, but if you need anything complex, like, you know, complex function key processing and cursor positioning and all of that kind of stuff, it's pretty necessary to go to Synergy Windows, and it's a fairly easy process usually. But also there can be some benefits of just migrating your current terminal UI to Synergy Windows, even if you're not doing a platform migration, even if you're still on a character-based environment. You know, the ability to do windowing within an application and pop up something new on top of your existing character-based UI can be the solution to an awful lot of those other problems that we just talked about. The inability to go from one program to another without logging out and back to the menu and over there. If you can identify, you know, a key set of reasons why people need to do that, and it's usually things like, well, the phone rings and I need to go look up an order for a customer, things like that. So make it available throughout the system. If you need to go look up an order, you press some function key and it pops up a window and you pick order lookup. And no matter where they are in the application, let them go and do those common inquiries or whatever the functionality is. It's fairly trivial to do, even on the character-based system, and could be the solution to some of these problems. Enhanced reporting is another common thing that can be easily done that can have a real positive impact on the way that a current application is able to maintain its usefulness within an organization. Very often I hear we just can't get the information we need out of the system these days. And even if we do, it's in, you know, this horrible old tabulated Courier 12-point format that's really hard to read, and we can't get the ribbons for the old printer anymore, by the way, and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, everybody expects PDF now, and PDF is so easy to do. We have a PDF API, there's third-party components you can use to create PDFs. It's trivial almost to come up with PDF-type output that is graphical in nature and includes charts, and even, you know, even exporting data to Excel or other formats is fairly easy to do, even on character-based platforms. I helped somebody on a VMS system a little while ago come up with a mechanism where the code on VMS could generate an Excel spreadsheet. We implemented a little mechanism through a web service running on the desktop PC, because web services don't have to always be to a server. They can be used for a server to talk to an application running on a PC. So we wrote some code that made the VMS code produce Excel spreadsheets, and it would send them through a web service to whichever PC the user was running on and pop up Excel on their desktop. That kind of thing. Some of this stuff is fairly trivial to implement and can really make a big difference. Email document distribution as well. So often we still rely on printed output and faxed output even. I'm constantly surprised on how many people still use fax or still have fax there. It's something that always comes up if you're doing a platform migration. Oh yeah, what about the old fax box in the corner that we haven't touched for 10 years? But we think we've still got one customer that we send fax invoices to and they insist on it. You know, there's so many easier ways of doing that, both distributing your own printed output, PDF output, Excel spreadsheets and so on through email, or using online services to do electronic web-based faxing rather than some custom solution. So again, think about that, and is there some way you can improve that? Putting your data to work, the whole it's got to be in a relational database thing, is very rarely the case. And you've got to bear in mind that if you really want to take your application to a relational database and factor out your Synergy ISAM files, it's a very large project, typically. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible. There are people in the room who have done it. Well, they would say they've done it. I would challenge them to prove to me that they're still not using quite a bit of Synergy ISAM as well, perhaps. But rewriting your code to go to a relational database is a very large project. I hesitate to use the rewrite word, but it kind of almost is. Exporting data to a relational database, however, on a periodic basis is trivial. Okay, especially with access to tools like CodeGen and the Synergy repository. If you've got a repository in place already, you could set up the code needed to export your entire data set to a relational database in a matter of hours. It's trivial, and I'm not exaggerating that. If you want to replicate data, the difference being export is a one-shot deal and then you do it again the next day or the next day or the next day. Actually, maybe not do it again because change tracking in Synergy ISAM can seriously make that a lot faster and a lot easier. So maybe you export net change once a day. The difference is replication means on an ongoing basis. So as the application changes its data in ISAM, that change is almost immediately applied to the relational database. That's a process that we've been talking about at conferences for a number of years now. We've got examples online of how to do it. I've done some work on that process recently and improved it, and I would describe that as almost trivial now. And in fact, one of the customers in the room right here, we did that. I worked with Phil at one of his end users in September time last year and implemented it for them in about 4 days. And you did some work after that and finished it off, but it's up and running, and it was very trivial to do. And again, more information. I'm going to present a session on replicating data to a database on Thursday. Once you've got the data in a database, maybe you want to take it another step. And another thing that's becoming very popular these days is to say, okay, in a replicated scenario, we're talking a one-to-one. We're going to take the ISAM file and put it in the database and keep it up to date. Okay, but the columns, the field names, the keys, the indexes, they're going to be the same, basically. We're just taking the data and exporting it. Data warehousing, on the other hand, might involve taking data from your Synergy application as well as a bunch of other sources and globbing it all together into one database and changing the schema so that it makes sense along the lines of what do you need to do with the data. So massaging the data and transforming it into a more useful format these days, not necessarily going with a one-to-one. And again, we've got some skills in that area. We have one of Don's consultants who is an expert in that area joining us. I believe she'll be here tomorrow and Thursday, and she's going to be presenting a session on that particular subject straight after my replication session on Thursday. Code refactoring. This is a very popular part of a lot of stuff that Don's team have been doing over the last couple of years. The concept of code refactoring is saying we've got all of this functionality in our application and we want to get at that functionality from other places, from other environments, from other applications. Maybe we want to implement a web services layer that hits our current code base. So we're going to refactor our code and massage the code so that we don't break what it currently does, but we get new ways of accessing that code by restructuring it and being able to call into it through XF Server Plus or call into it through, a Symfony Harmony stored procedure kind of mechanism, or put a RESTful web service onto it and talk to it that way. And that's another thing to be considered. Is if you're going to start and build a new application, do you want to start totally from scratch, or would you like to leverage what you've built up? Usually it's the latter. Occasionally we did come up with a situation a couple of years ago where it's like, no, I don't want to do that, I'm just starting over. But almost always, most of us want to reuse that code. And it's absolutely, definitely possible to do so. Building a new user interface. If you are going to build a new user interface, then are you going to do a phased migration? A few years ago, we would have a lot of discussions about, you go to Windows, and then you start improving your UI on a screen-by-screen basis. And that kind of worked a little while, for a little while. It was historically very popular and lets you get some fast initial results. But most of our applications are somewhat modal in nature. The whole way the app works is you do this, then you back out, then you do this, then you back out. And that whole infrastructure, while you may be able to replace individual screens, you're not probably going to get a great overall user experience result. So starting with a clean slate for a new UI, thin UI layer, talking to a refactored business logic layer through a web service, again, might be a more popular choice these days. And certainly we're seeing people going in that direction more than rebuilding what they've got 100%. If you are going to start selecting a new UI technology, I would just caution you that there are a lot of choices out there. It's a decision you need to make very carefully. Even if you say, yep, we need desktop, what are you going to do? WPF, UWP, WinForms? I say, really? But there's an awful lot of WinForms code out there. I wouldn't suggest new development set off doing that, but a lot of people do that. Probably WPF or UWP. But it's not an obvious choice. It's something that takes a lot of thought. Is web a serious choice these days? Web was very, very popular in the late 90s and the early noughties and then kind of tailed off a little bit. I'm definitely seeing in my consulting efforts a definite resurgence in interest in web because web technologies and the JavaScript frameworks and the state of CSS and so on has now matured to a certain point where if a web application is well implemented, it's really difficult to tell whether it's a web app or a desktop app. The functionality is essentially the same. Okay, it's in a browser and you can see the address bar at the top. But in terms of look and feel and functionality and UX, user experience, web is a real major player these days and can be a better solution if you're in a distributed scenario with limited bandwidth. So something to think about. Mobile, again, think about, do we need mobile platforms? Even if you don't need mobile today or don't think you do today, I'm guessing you probably do in a few years' time because the whole state of IT is going in that direction. More and more we use our tablets and our cell phones and less we use our computers. And again, think about the Telnet SSH thing. Today, if you're a character-based application, your bandwidth and latency requirements are very, very low. UI versus UX, again, this is, Bill referred to the old elevator button this morning. I'm referring back, of course, to 2 years ago at this conference when our friend Billy Hollis came and enlightened us about UI design and UX design and kind of reminded us how, we don't like to admit it, but programmers don't tend to make very good UI and UX designers. So, if you're going to get into a new UI, that UI needs to have a great user interface and a great user experience, and the two are not the same. One is what it looks like, one is how it behaves and how you interact with it, and you need both. Radical change is probably needed. We don't build pop-up searches and modal apps anymore. It's a different world these days, and we, the global we, don't tend to be very good at it. It's a very specialized skill. We have built some relationships with Billy and his company. A couple of our customers are working with them. They're obviously not the only option, but consider if you're going to get into a new UI UX project, consider getting some outside help, at least at the outset, to set you out on the right path. Application shell. I'm going to mention this briefly. Billy talked about the concept of an application shell. You're going to see an application shell demonstrated in a few minutes. What does an application shell do? Think menu on steroids. It's not just a menu, it provides all kinds of services to the application such that developing programs is just developing fairly simple plugins that drop into place and inherit the look and feel and all that kind of stuff. Such that the UI UX designers take care of the look and feel and programmers just lay out forms at that point with some training, because even laying out the forms is, there's a lot of science there these days. But a good shell takes care of not just navigation and presentation, but authentication, authorization, favorites, lists, recently used, all of those things that make apps easy to use. And again, I'm going to shut up about that subject because Brian and Nate are going to show you what I'm talking about in a few minutes' time. Building a mobile application, again, becoming more and more popular. It's something we've talked about for a long time, but few of us have done it just yet, but it's now coming up as a very frequent thing. And again, the Xamarin toolset is a pretty compelling story. It really is. Whether you use it in its original mode of being able to have a shared back end with discrete iOS, Android, and Windows UIs and others now, or whether you use the later Xamarin Forms where you also get shared UI and just very, very thin platform-specific layers for platform-specific APIs like the accelerometers and stuff that Richard talked about this morning. There are obviously lots of other mobile development mechanisms out there, but Xamarin is a pretty compelling story, and it's built into Visual Studio, and it's free these days. Anatomy of modern applications. If you're going to be developing a modern application, it's almost certainly going to be a distributed application. So if you're not experienced in that, again, it can take some practice to design those APIs well so that you're really separating that user interface from the business logic, from the underlying data access. Talked a little bit about that in my session about web services. Bear in mind that in Synergy you do have a choice of various ways, and these are just some of them. There's probably another 5 or 6 different possible combinations, but it's not obvious. You want a distributed app, XF Server Plus and XF Netlink might still be a good solution depending on what your back-end server is. It might be that having a web service in the middle between a client and a server environment is the way to go. That web service might choose to use XF Server Plus and XF Netlink. If the back-end is VMS, for example, that's very frequently a good approach still. Or it might be that you have a web service and use Synergy.net code directly and just hit the data with the select class. The point is there's lots and lots of options, and don't just assume we need to do it this way, because there might be a better way. There might be a different combination of ways of putting these things together that makes more sense and gives you more benefit. And also cloud is becoming more and more of a question that people are asking these days. And you know, it's a complex thing these days. If you look at Richard mentioned Microsoft Azure earlier, there are like 450 different services that Azure offers these days. If you look at the list of services, it's huge. You know, it's not just, from something as simple as a remote virtual machine to hosted web applications and worker roles and databases and blob storage and all of these different things that are potentially available to you, many of which are just accessed via RESTful web APIs. So sure, you can hit that from Synergy and leverage those things. Not all of them, some of them aren't, but a lot of them are just RESTful web APIs that you can absolutely consume and take advantage of, even from your traditional Synergy code on VMS. You know, common myths. Cloud requires good bandwidth. Well, doesn't everything? Cloud is expensive. Have you actually factored in all the costs? What do you spend on air conditioning and maintenance of 15-year-old IBM hardware and blah, 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 blah? There's a lot of costs that you're already paying. And I think cloud today equals flexibility, security, scalability, resilience, and a whole bunch of extra stuff. So give it some thought. It might well be part of your current solution. Very quickly, I'm almost done, but just a quick call out for, you know, building a bot. Web robots or bots over the years have got a bad name for good reason in some cases, for things like viral infections and hijacking, and 98% of my Synergex email gets caught by our spam filters these days, literally, thanks to all those bots out there. But bots are one of the latest hot things in this industry. You look at the Siris, the Alexas, the Google Home, whatever it is things, these automated software agents that are using artificial intelligence techniques to help us do all kinds of things. And essentially, as far as we're concerned as developers at the back end, it's just a web service. Okay? There's frameworks to help us put it all together, but it's becoming, I don't think it's there right now, but it's becoming an important element for business. And I think that trend will continue. And again, we'll have a presentation tomorrow afternoon. Tate and Phil will show you how you can go about building a bot using Synergy if you wish to do so. Wrapping up, all I tried to do here was say, these are some of the things that always crop up, and try and point out that to a lot of them, there are common solutions. It's not necessary to throw everything away and start from scratch. There's an awful lot of stuff you can do with your existing code, your existing data, and so on. Many of these subjects we're going to touch on throughout the conference and go into a lot more detail. Certainly about the database stuff, the bot stuff. Richard's going to get into the mobile stuff more in the post-conference workshop, and so on. Consider all the options, be open, and don't think you'll get it right first time. Really give it some serious thought. Involve everybody in the discussions, involve as many people as you can, not necessarily in the decisions, because if you try and involve everybody in the decisions, you'll never make a decision, but take input from everybody as widely as you can. Look for quick wins first as well, then attack the bigger picture. Okay, that's all I have for this session. Are there any questions? Okay, thank you.